Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're tackling a listener request, this time diving deep into voluntary carbon markets.
Yeah, a lot of folks want to know how they actually work.
And we're using a fascinating document as our guide, JP Morgan Chase's Carbon Market Principles.
We figured we could use it kind of like a window into how the whole system works.
Exactly. By the end of this deep dive, you'll be able to hold your own in any conversation about carbon markets.
So let's kick things off with the basics. Why do carbon markets even exist?
Well, the idea is they're supposed to help us get to net zero emissions.
But they're definitely not like a magic solution.
Right, and JP Morgan Chase is very clear about that in their principles.
Yeah, they emphasize that carbon credit should be part of a bigger strategy, not a replacement for actually cutting emissions.
There's got to be a multi-pronged approach, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. We need to reduce emissions and remove what's already out there.
And the latest IPCC report basically said carbon removal is non-negotiable if we want to hit those net zero targets.
So voluntary carbon markets are one way to get investment and action flowing toward both of those goals.
Okay, but for those of us who aren't finance experts, can you break down how these markets actually work?
Sure. Imagine you've got these project developers creating carbon credits.
These could be things like planting trees or building wind farms.
Right, exactly. And then on the other side, you've got buyers, companies, individuals, even governments who want to offset their own emissions.
So basically, companies can balance out their carbon footprint by buying these credits.
Exactly. And there are all these other players in between, like brokers and registries, that help facilitate the whole buying and selling process.
And here's where it gets interesting. JP Morgan Chase isn't just watching from the sidelines.
Right. They're actually involved on multiple levels.
So they're practicing what they preach.
In a way, yeah. They buy credits to offset their own emissions from their operations, but they're also a major player in the market itself, providing financial services to other buyers and sellers.
So they have a pretty unique perspective on how these markets work.
Yeah, and they're using that position to advocate for higher quality carbon credits, especially the ones focused on removals with long-term storage.
And they even developed their own methodology, the Carbon Compass.
Right, which only counts high-integrity removals toward meeting their financing portfolio targets.
Okay, so we've got this complex system with a major player like JP Morgan pushing for quality. But how do we as individuals even begin to evaluate the legitimacy of these carbon credits?
That's where these carbon market principles come in. They provide a framework for assessing the legitimacy and value of a carbon credit.
So let's break down those principles starting with real. What does that even mean in this context?
It means you have to prove that the emissions reductions or removals are actually happening. A project can't just say, we planted a bunch of trees.
You have to prove those trees are actually growing and absorbing carbon.
Exactly. There needs to be solid evidence, like third-party verification, project documentation, even on-the-ground observation.
Okay, so it's about accountability and transparency.
Absolutely. And then you've got the next principle, measurable.
Meaning we need a reliable way to quantify the impact using hard numbers.
Exactly. So if a project is preventing deforestation, you need to show how much deforestation would have happened without the project.
To establish a baseline.
Right. And it's not just about the numbers themselves. The methods used to collect that data need to be rigorous and verifiable.
Like satellite imagery on the ground, measurements, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Very scientific and precise.
Okay. Starting to see why these markets can be so complex. A lot of scrutiny involved.
And then there's additional, meaning the project wouldn't have happened anyway without the carbon credit revenue.
So a project wouldn't qualify if it was already legally mandated or financially viable on its own.
Exactly. The carbon credits have to be the driving force behind the project.
And that can be tricky to prove, right?
Oh, yeah. It involves analyzing financial projections, regulations, all sorts of things.
Okay, on to the next hurdle. A carbon credit project has to clear. Unique and traceable. What does that mean?
Well, think about it like this. You buy a carbon credit to offset your flight. You want to be sure that the emission reduction or removal tied to that credit is linked to a specific verifiable action.
And that no one else can claim that same credit for their own offsetting.
Exactly. Each credit needs a unique ID to prevent double counting.
So how do we make sure all of this is actually happening correctly? Who's checking up on these projects?
That's where independently verified comes in. A reputable third party has to confirm that the project meets all the criteria we've talked about so far.
So it's like an independent auditor giving it a stamp of approval.
Precisely. It could be a recognized carbon standard or a certification body. They come in, assess the project, and verify that it's legit.
Okay, that adds a layer of accountability. But what about the bigger picture? Do we have to worry about projects just shifting emissions elsewhere instead of actually reducing them?
That's a great question, and it's addressed by the principle of leakage avoidance.
The leakage avoidance. Tell me more.
So leakage happens when a project unintentionally moves emissions to a different location. For example, let's say there's a project to prevent deforestation in one area.
But it just pushes the logging activities into a neighboring forest?
Exactly. In that case, you haven't really reduced emissions at all, just shifted them around.
So how do you prevent that?
You have to assess whether the project is addressing potential leakage. Are there measures in place to prevent activities from being displaced? Are there safeguards to make sure the emissions reductions are genuine?
So we're not just looking at the project in isolation, but its impact on the bigger system.
Right. And that leads us to another crucial factor, durability permanence.
So durability permanence, I mean, that seems pretty straightforward. We want to make sure that carbon stays locked up for as long as possible, right?
Exactly. Durability is all about how long that carbon will be stored. Some projects, like planting trees, offer shorter-term storage.
Because trees can be harvested or affected by wildfires, things like that.
Right, whereas other projects, like certain types of mineralization, aim for much longer-term storage, potentially trapping that carbon for centuries or even millennia.
So I guess the longer the carbon is stored, the more valuable the credit, because it represents a more lasting impact.
Absolutely, and it's important to remember that durability can vary a lot depending on the project type.
So you really need to do your research.
Yeah, when you're evaluating a credit, you have to consider what's typical for that kind of project and what measures, if any, are in place to minimize the risk of that carbon being released.
Makes sense to prioritize those projects that offer the most potential for long-term storage.
Absolutely. And finally, we come to a principle that's getting a lot more attention these days, climate equity.
This is a big one. We need to make sure climate action benefits everyone, especially those communities that are most vulnerable to climate change.
Couldn't agree more. And JP Chase recognizes this too. This principle emphasizes that carbon projects should aim to support and empower frontline communities, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups.
So this could mean involving local communities in project development or making sure the projects create economic opportunities for those who need them most.
Exactly. It's about ensuring that climate action isn't just effective, but also just and equitable in how those benefits are shared.
So it's not just about solving the problem, it's about solving it the right way.
Right, leaving no one behind in the transition to a low-carbon future. But here's the thing, JP doesn't stop at just these core principles.
We go even further.
Yeah, they consider a whole range of additional factors when they're evaluating carbon credits.
Like they're saying, we're not just checking boxes here.
Exactly. They're really digging deep to find the best possible projects. For example, they look at co-benefits.
Meaning?
They want to see projects that offer advantages beyond just carbon reduction or removal. Things like biodiversity protection or job creation.
I like that. It's not just about the carbon, it's about the bigger impact.
Right. And then, of course, there's cost. They want to make sure they're getting the most impact for their investment. You know, finding projects that deliver real results at a reasonable price.
Makes sense. We all want to know our money is being used effectively. But how do they assess a project's potential to really make a difference on a larger scale?
That's where scalability comes in. Can the project be replicated and expanded to have a wider impact?
So they're looking for projects that can be scaled up to remove or reduce significant amounts of carbon, not just small-scale initiatives.
Exactly. And then there's innovation.
Always important.
Absolutely. They're interested in projects that are using new technologies or approaches to improve the way carbon markets work, pushing the boundaries and finding new ways to tackle this global challenge.
So they're looking for those cutting-edge projects that could revolutionize the carbon market.
Exactly. And their document actually breaks down different types of carbon projects, too.
Like what?
You've got your forestry projects, agriculture and soil carbon initiatives, renewable energy projects, and even some really exciting stuff happening with engineered removals like direct air capture.
I'd love to learn more about those different types.
Yeah.
Each one must have its own set of considerations and potential drawbacks, right?
Definitely. Each project type has its own nuances in terms of storage duration, potential benefits, and risks. For example, forestry projects are great for things like biodiversity and habitat protection, but their storage duration can be shorter if the trees are vulnerable to things like harvesting or wildfires.
And imagine engineered removals, while they offer the potential for longer-term storage, come with their own set of challenges like cost and energy requirements.
Exactly. It's all about finding the right balance, weighing the trade-offs, and finding the mix of projects that creates a truly impactful portfolio. And speaking of innovation, there's this one project type that really caught my eye, biochar.
Biochar, what's that?
It's pretty cool. It involves heating biomass, things like agricultural waste in a low oxygen environment, which creates this charcoal-like material. And then you can add that biochar to the soil where it can store carbon for potentially hundreds or even thousands of years.
Wow, that's incredible. So it sounds like the carbon market is full of innovation, all these new solutions popping up.
It's a dynamic and rapidly evolving field. There's a real sense of urgency driving innovation, and it's amazing to see so many people working on solutions.
It's definitely been eye-opening learning about all this. Voluntary carbon markets are complex, but they also hold immense potential.
I agree. And while JP Morgan's perspective is just one viewpoint, their principles offer a great starting point for anyone who wants to understand how to assess the credibility and value of these carbon credits. They've clearly done their homework.
So for anyone listening who's new to carbon markets, JP Morgan's principles are a valuable tool for understanding the key considerations and evaluating projects. It's a way to cut through all the noise and make informed decisions.
And don't be afraid to ask questions. The carbon market is still relatively new and constantly evolving. The more we engage with it, the more we learn, and the better equipped we'll be to make a positive impact.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into these voluntary carbon markets, here's a question for you.
Okay, shoot.
If you were investing in a carbon project, what would matter most to you? What kind of impact would you want your investment to have?
That's a good question. It really makes you think about everything we've been talking about today.
Would you go for those projects with long-term storage, even if they cost more? Or would you be more interested in projects that have those extra benefits for local communities, even if the carbon removal potential is a bit lower?
Tough choices for sure. There's no easy answer, is there?
Not really. It all comes down to your own values, I guess, and then making sure your investments line up with those values.
Right. It's like anything else. You want your money to support the things you believe in.
And I think this deep dive has shown us there are so many different approaches to carbon offsetting out there.
Definitely. There's something for everyone, whether you're all about maximizing carbon removal or you want to see tangible benefits for communities on the ground.
It's encouraging to see so many options. It means everyone has a chance to get involved in climate action, no matter their budget or priorities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the more people we have on board, the better our chances of creating a more sustainable future. It's a team effort, and every investment counts.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, that's a wrap for our deep dive into the world of voluntary carbon markets. Thanks for joining us. We hope you learned a thing or two.
And maybe even got inspired to take action.
Until next time, keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better future. See you on the next deep dive.